When you see black people at a bar mitzvah, it's very exciting. It's like a scary ride, and the kids just love it.
Many of us have been concerned by the apparent rise of the Hebrew Israelite movement, which is a movement that has connections to Judaism, although at the same time also to Christianity. And normally this would not present any kind of challenge to the Jewish community. They are not the first, and I certainly think they are not the last group of people who believe that they are of Jewish extraction, and there may in fact be some merit to that. That's going to be something we'll discuss in greater detail, God willing, next week. But what's frightening about this is that there's an unusual militancy among some of those groups. For example, this is from a protest that occurred just last week here in New York State, actually in the holy city of Brooklyn. And these are some of the flyers that were distributed. And you can see that the argument that many Hebrew Israelite groups maintain, not all, I shouldn't say many, I should say some, they argue that they are in fact the quote-unquote real Jews, and the other people who call themselves Jews, which basically means Ashkenazic Jews, are in fact imposters. And more than that, there is a kind of like an evil motive behind these imposters who have striven to displace the true Jews. And there's just a lot of nonsense going on with that. I myself can tell you that I've been an Ashkenazi Jew all my life, and I've never had any attempt to displace anybody else from their Jewish identity. As far as I'm concerned, they're perfectly welcome to believe whatever they want. It doesn't really bother me. I hope they don't impinge on my beliefs about my identity. And as you can see from this flyer, there's also, strange admixtures of Christian elements as well. Many of these Israelite movements, they prefer generally the term Israelite to Jew, borrow heavily from Christianity or lean Christian in their beliefs as well. And they tend to draw from some of the nastier elements of Christianity, like this passage from Revelation 2.9, referring to the synagogue of Satan. It's not a joke, because some of the more extreme, deranged people who associate with these movements have been associated also with terrible violence, including an awful shooting in Jersey City, some violence in upstate New York as well. Beyond the violence, we should note that there are many Israelite congregations that have very good relationship with other Jewish movements, even if there's still disagreement about who is Jewish and who is not. And a lot of this wrangling over who gets to use the term Jew to describe themselves has caused chaos among the various Black Israelite movements as well. So here's an important question. And it is certainly important, once again, if you judge by my YouTube comments box, because everybody seems to want to argue what color Jews were originally. We have no clear-cut answer from biblical texts or archaeological texts, but we do have some scientific data, and we do have some very suggestive data from both biblical texts and archaeological data. But if we assume that the people who live there today basically look like the people who lived there in antiquity, then we should be able to get a sense of what did Abraham and Sarah actually look like. So this is what typical Iraqis look like today. And you can see that they tend to have a little bit darker complexion. They tend to lean towards darker hair color, although the child on the right seems to have a little bit lighter hair color. I think they could easily pass for Hispanic in New York City, but basically they look Middle Eastern, as we would typically think of Middle Easterners. And if we look at Syrians, we have the same kind of more or less family of complexion, eye color, hair color. And this is probably based on a reasonable assumption that people back then sort of look like the people today who come from the same place, that this is probably what Abraham and Sarah look like. Now, there are other peoples living there, of course, and Israel in particular is at a crossroads between Africa and Asia and Europe, so there are lots of possible mixings. Let's get to that. Whiteness is, as it social scientists have demonstrated in so many ways, a social construct, and people are accepted or not accepted as white, which means essentially being, within the higher status of society, based on a whole host of factors, of which complexion is only one of them. And quite often there is kind of like a spectrum of skin colors that can still, as they say, pass. For Jews, whiteness was really not extended to them as people. When I say Jews, I mean Ashkenazic Jews here in America, really until the 1940s. In that brief honeymoon period after the Holocaust, which unfortunately seems to be waning now, where Jews were seen as part of the great triumvirate of American society, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, the idea of building a society that could include all of these different peoples together. Irish people also had to be whitened. That occurred at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. Italians also, around the same time as Jews, a little bit earlier, were also whitened and became, so to speak, white eligible. Let's get to the more simple question. Okay, we know a little bit about how Jews became white eligible and how they were considered white in American society in particular, but how did they get this specific skin tone? I mean, how did you take a picture and it looks sort of like this? So have a look at this diagram here, which shows a genetic bottleneck. The bottom end is earlier in time, and the top end is contemporary period. So here at the bottom, you've got Jews in ancient Israel, right? Jews living in the land of Israel for millennia. And then they have and at the very top, this is modern Ashkenazi Jews. In the ancient period, you've got lots of people mixing in with the small original Jewish community that's associated with Abraham. You have people like the Bible refers to Ruth, who comes from the land of Moab, and other historical sources have people like Antipater, who came from Idumea. You have Helena of Adiambene. These are just like famous, well-known people, but obviously there are thousands of just neighboring peoples who end up marrying in this small group that trace their lineage back to the Exodus and beyond. So they're living in the land of Israel, slowly incorporating other peoples in their genetic stock. And then you have two disastrous wars with Rome. The Great War of 66 through 74, which resulted in the destruction of the temple, and a massive number of Jewish slaves shipped off to Rome. Josephus, who was our primary source for this period, he often exaggerates numbers, but many historians think he's probably pretty accurate in this period. He writes about 97,000 Jews being shipped off into slavery. And then 60 years later, you have another revolt, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and in 135, the land is once again denuded of people, particularly in Judea itself, and Jews are shipped off to Rome for the slave markets, or also in Asia Minor and other places. So you've got now a big population of Jews living in Rome. And by the way, there was a population of Jews living in Rome that predated the war. There's references to it in a lot of the rabbinic literature that goes back well into the 1st century before the Common Era, even some scattered references for the 2nd century before the Common Era, when Judah Maccabee first made a pact with the Romans. So now we've got a big population in Rome of Jews, and they become free after some time, and they're significantly mixing, just like they were in Israel, with South Italians, and then later with North Italians. And then you have the founder event. And this is something which we actually have described in Jewish literary sources. So this is not like a new surprise to us at all. Sometime around the year 800, a small group of Jews left northern Italy. We even know the names of some of them, the Colonimus family, for example. They left their homes in northern Italy, and they made their way up to the Rhineland in contemporary Germany. Those people form the nucleus of Ashkenazi Jewry.